Babs was originally built in 1923 by Count Louis Zabrowski. It was the fourth of his Chitty Chitty Bang Bang big aero-engine cars. He sort of run out of names by the time he got to Chitty 3, and so he called Babs the Higham Special while it was in his ownership. But unfortunately he was killed in a racing accident, and the car was sold as part of his estate sale. It was bought by Parry Thomas late 24, early 1925 as a cheap way of going and doing some record breaking. He paid £125 for the car. So Thomas took the car to Pendine in 1925 to do some first record attempts. They ran it up and down the beach with no great success. He did some work to it over the winter of 25-26 and returned to Pendine in the spring of 1926 and set a new land speed record, first at 169 miles an hour, and then the following day he broke that record at 171 miles an hour. And that record stood for a while, but was broken by Campbell in Bluebird, which he'd spent £10,000 building. So it gives you an idea of the scale of costs involved. So Thomas had an opportunity to have one last go at breaking the record, and so he went back to the Pendine in 1927 for one last fateful attempt. The record is set by going up and back through a measured mile. Thomas went up through the measured mile, came back down, and a spectator walked through the timing beam. The run on the way up the beach was at over 180 miles an hour and had broken the record. They had to go again. So they turned round and essentially went for their third run up the beach, and slowing at the end, having done, one assumes 180 plus miles an hour again, in slowing down way beyond the measured mile, something went wrong and the car had a massive accident and Thomas was killed. There was a lot of conjecture at the time that Thomas had been killed by the chain coming off and hitting him, which it turns out was a myth. They elected to bury the car in the beach in the sand dunes at Pendine because they had no real way of transporting it home and it wasn't worth anything when they got it back. My father had been restoring a number of cars and somebody asked him, well, what are you going to do next? And a few pints in, he said, I've got this great idea. He started getting permissions and getting the idea together. Even if he found a few small components, then maybe they could go in a museum as some sort of memorial to Parry Thomas. My father and my uncle and my cousin went down with 3 shovels and a couple of cans of beer, and suddenly realised that actually there was more to do in terms of restoring it and getting it running rather than just simply having a few components that people could look at. So the car got back to my family home. It was a small workshop on the side of the house in rural Snowdonia, and Father set about restoring it. He was surprised at how complete it was. There was significant accident damage, but there's also the fact that it had been buried in salt water for 42 years. And there's a strange effect that if you put steel and aluminium together in salt water, they form a battery cell and you get something called cathodic protection. So the steel components are protected, but the aluminium is sacrificed. The best example is the gearbox, where you could poke your finger through the case, but the ball bearings and the ball races in the gearbox still in the car. So there was lots of help from lots of people. It was one of those stories that captured the imagination in the late 60s, early 70s. And so within 2 years of digging it up, it was running. So the engine's a Liberty V12 aero engine, 27 litre, 4 carburettors. It's got plenty of power, I think. Each cylinder is 2¼ litres, which is the same as a sort of small C-class Merc. That's just one. It kind of gives you an idea of the scale. I can just remember one of my early memories is it going up the main A road outside the house on the back of a Land Rover trying to start it. It was a fantastic day out. And the local police turned up and said, what on earth are you doing? And they said, well, it's quite obvious what we're doing. He said, we can't do that with all this traffic. I better stop the traffic. And so they shut the A5, the London Holyhead Road, while the car went up and down some bleak Welsh valley scaring the sheep. It's got very little in the way of brakes. But if you're record braking or you're going around Brooklands, you don't really need brakes. However, we're here at Goodwood and going up the Festival Speed Hill, you do need brakes. And so most of the time we just use a handbrake. And when you're coming to the corner, you just put the handbrake on, leave it on, change down, then switch the handbrake off and turn in. That's basically driving it. I have a a long-term view that it now needs restoring. It's been out of the ground longer than it was buried. Some of the stuff, the paint's been on some of the bits 50 years. It had undertracing period, the undertrays have never been refitted to the car. The original bodywork exists. It's in the National Museum of Wales's archive. The frame's all the original. The steel frame, the blue panels that are steel are original, but the aluminium skin is all new, the bits that are painted white because of this corrosion in salt water. But I kind of have a view that maybe we ought to weld all the corrosion holes back up and use all the original skins and extend it and get it all right. That's going to take a lot of work, but it'd be really cool to put back. And they don't have to be perfect because they're original. It's an interesting question about what Thomas would think. He was an electromechanical engineer, and I think he wouldn't care very much about whether it was here or not. I suspect he was a futures man rather than a past man, if you see what I mean. I think he'd be over there looking at the electric cars and going, oh yeah, all that electrical stuff leaves me cold. I like 27-litre aero engines on stub exhaust. It's much more fun as far as I'm concerned. There's no reason why it wouldn't do 150, 160 mile an hour now. All it needs is somebody nuts behind the wheel.